All right, Psalm 132. We started last week looking at the covenant that God made with David, and I mentioned that this represents the pinnacle covenant that God makes with his people in the Old Testament. It's not distinct from the covenants that precede. We have one covenant of grace that is unfolding in various layers. It begins back in the garden after the fall, when God announces that the seed of the woman will triumph or will bruise the head of the seed of the serpent. That's the first indication we get. If you were just reading Genesis 1 to 3, you didn't read the rest of the Bible, you would never have guessed that. But in the light of later revelation, we know that's where it begins. We know the people from that day saw that they were expecting the birth of a child who would deliver them from the curse that God had placed upon the earth, because Noah got the name that he had, because his parents believed he was the one. And while they were wrong about that, they were right. He was like him. He was like the Messiah that would come. Then we come to the covenant with Abraham, and we find that in him all the nations are to be blessed, and in particular, in his seed, all the nations are to be blessed. So now this promised seed of the woman is also the seed of Abraham, whom God has chosen. We looked last time, as I said, at the covenant made with David in 2 Samuel 7, skipped over the fact that it being made with David is itself a fulfillment of another layer of the covenant that was unfolded in Genesis chapter 49. This is the scene of the blessing of Jacob upon his sons as he is about to die. And in Genesis 49, Judah is singled out with the promised blessing that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. So there's a tantalizing detail that emerges at that point in time, that somehow or other Judah, though he be not the firstborn, is nonetheless going to attain to some form of power and will possess a scepter, that is to say, a ruling symbol, and that the scepter shall not depart from Judah until the blessing comes. So we have that layer that is brought in. And now between last week and Christmas, we're going to focus on how this all comes down to the promised seed of David, and we want to look at Psalm 132 as we begin here today. Remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jair. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness. Let your saints shout for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the favor of your anointed one. The Lord swore to David a sure oath, from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and my testimonies that I shall teach them, their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provisions. I will satisfy her poor with bread. Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. There I will make a horn to spread out for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown will shine. All right, another psalm in which the promised seed of David is set before us as the king of an everlasting kingdom. This is one of the psalms in which the hope of Israel rests. All that God had promised from the beginning to Adam and Eve, that the seed of the woman would promise, all the way to the giving of the covenant made with David, Israel's hope, or you might say, brought down to focus upon some particular chosen seed of David who will be given an everlasting kingdom. Before we get done here today, I hope to get you to Isaiah chapter 9 to look at how that hope lives in the prophets. Here, before we move on to that, I want to talk about this particular psalm in the place it is in the book of Psalms. Last week, we were looking at Psalm 89. And Psalm 89 is another Davidic covenant psalm. It comes right at the end of book 3. Now, Dr. Thomas has been preaching us through book 2. And we are at the penultimate sermon today, Psalm 71. Next Sunday will be Psalm 72, and that is the climax of book 2. Psalm 72 is a glorious picture of the coming of the kingdom of God to the earth, stretching out without bound across all of creation. It is just as glorious a picture of the future as can be. One of the greatest sermons I had ever heard in my life was on that particular psalm. And it came at, one might say, the most unexpected of times. I was in England. I was with our choir, some of our choir, and some of the choir from the Centennial Church down the street. They had put together a little music tour. And if you work with a tour company, if you get at least 10 people to sign up for the tour, then they give you a free ticket. All right, so they offered me the free ticket if I would come along and give lectures in church history as they went from place to place to do their concerts and so on. And so we started up in Scotland, made our way. The last weekend and the last night, we were in London. And we had gotten there on a Saturday. The only full day that we would have in London was Sunday, and flight was out the next morning on Monday. So Saturday, we're gathered together, having our dinner and so on. What's our plan for the next day? Well, we've only got one day in London. Okay, for most of the people on the trip, this is the only opportunity they'll probably ever have in their life to get to London. So what do they want to do? Well, they want to see the sights of London. All right, so how do we do it? Well, why don't we go to church at Westminster Abbey? I said, I don't think that's a good idea. They said, why not? I said, well, it's just not going to be a place where I think we're going to feel at home and so on. Well, I know, but if we go there, we'll be able to see the Abbey, and then we're not far from the Tower of London. We can go over and see the Tower of London, blah, 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 this, that, and the other, and so on. Anyway, I lost out. I had been to London before, so it was no big deal to me since I lived over there. So, all right, we go to Westminster Abbey. Well, it was just as bad as I thought, and worse. And worse. It turned out it was the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Okay? The guy got up and he denied the doctrine of original sin and the creation of the human race. He talked about the fact that we didn't drop down out of heaven. We grew up out of the slime. It was just thrilling from beginning to end. It was so bad. I was struggling with my conscience as to whether I say anything going out. Well, while we were there, tourists are ready to come in after the service is over, and so they got to push us out one direction in the abbey and bring in the tourists in the other. And the minister and his liturgist are there. And as you're going, I can now see that it's not going to be possible to choose which lane you get into up there. You're coming down a center lane, and they are doing the dividing. They're pushing you this way or they're pushing you that way and so on. So I'm struggling with my conscience, and then we get there, and I get pushed to the other guy's thing. And I thought, well, thank God. All right, I can just leave here and so on. But as we get there, we had just a brief. I said to the guy, I said, oh, by the way, I said, does the Church of England no longer believe in the doctrine of original sin? He said, well, I do, and I intend to say something to him about it. I said, well, put my vote with yours. I said, it's been confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. All right, so we finished that. But I felt like I had been in the presence of the golden calf that morning. I just felt filthy. I hadn't worshiped God, I had sat through an assault. So anyway, we had lunch, and people were, they've got their maps out of London. They're going to head here, this, that, and the other, and so on. I thought, I don't want to do all that. So anyway, they scattered, and I'm sitting there at the lunch table. It's about 2 o'clock, and I thought, what am I going to do? And I thought, I've never seen St. Paul's Cathedral. The one time we got to visit London when we lived over there, I had volunteered to take my son Stephen away to give my wife and her sister and her mother a chance to go do things that they wanted to do without Stephen, who was not always eager to do the things they were eager to do. So he and I went off to the zoo. Now, one of the things they did was go by St. Paul's Cathedral. They didn't go in, but they walked by it and so on. So I had never seen it. And I thought, well, I'll just go over to St. Paul's. And, of course, I had the whole day. Everybody was gone. We weren't scheduled to meet back till time for evening service. So what do? I said, well, I'll walk. I had my little tourist map there. I'll walk. Let me tell you this. If you are in Westminster, you do not want to walk to St. Paul's Cathedral. It took 2 hours. That was a lot longer a walk than it appeared to be on the little tourist map, I can tell you that. It was a long walk. So I get there a little bit before 4 o'clock, and I go in there, and the place is kind of empty. And, have you ever been to St. Paul's? I mean, if there is an attribute of God displayed in the architecture of St. Paul's Cathedral, it is immensity. I mean, the dome of that place will swallow you up. It's just gigantic. You walk in there. So, I'm walking around. Well, all of a sudden it seems like traffic is picking up. More people are coming in. And I'm thinking, I'll bet they're going to have another service here. And I think, do I dare risk this? I thought to myself, I can't take this again. I just can't take this again. So I thought, well, I'll sit in the back row. And if it gets bad, I'm out of here. I'm just a tourist. So I sat down. Well, the guy started out with a sermon. And for that day, the readings of the day are, of course, determined by the lectionary. The lectionary is determined by the religious calendar, which, of course, took no notice whatsoever of the fact that this was the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. This was the feast of the Transfiguration that was being commemorated. So our gospel reading had come from one of the Gospels in the Transfiguration narrative. I think it was Mark's Gospel, Mark 9 that day. I've forgotten the third reading, but the psalm reading of the day was Psalm 72, the end of book 2. You can look forward to Derek's exposition of this next week. Well, this guy starts out on the sermon, and he says, August is quite a month for anniversaries, isn't it? Today, of course, we're thinking of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and the beginning of the nuclear age of warfare. He said, August was actually an important month for the beginning of World War I. He said this commemorates the end of World War II, so to speak. He said, but August, and he started in about various things that happened. And somehow Marilyn Monroe even came into this. I don't know whether she died then or was born then or something like that. And I thought, oh, good heavens, where are we going with this? Anyway, he put that stuff out there, and then he moved into the text. And let me tell you, when he moved into the text, he moved into the text. He was there to preach the Bible. And this sermon started out the size of a man's hand on the thing, and it was growing into a cloud, and it just filled that dome with the glory of God. He took Psalm 72, and he started talking about the kingdom of God stretching from one end of the heavens to the other, as far as the east is from the west, etc. And it just went on, and I just sat there overwhelmed at this. I hadn't seen anything like it. I'd have to tell you, going in there, I wasn't any kind of a fan at all of preaching from the lectionary. And one would have thought that this day, above all days, would have been the proof of my concerns about the lectionary. What were my concerns? Well, the lectionary is made 3 years more in advance. Okay, what you're going to be preaching 3 years down the road has been determined by a group of people sitting down here and so on, and that's what you're going to preach 3 years from now, without any idea as to what's going on in the world or where people are and whatnot. It just seemed to me that the lectionary was totally insensitive to what was going on in the world today. That preachers need to have a bit more freedom in the midst of that. And this guy just dug into the assigned readings, as I said. He's preaching the Transfiguration. He's preaching Psalm 72, and as I said, I've forgotten the other, but he treated them all, and he treated them all faithfully and fairly, and I was happy for it, nonetheless. But then it all came together, back on exactly what we were talking about that day. All those things that I thought were throwaway dates at the beginning, about World War II, World War I, this, that, and the other, and so on. He just started naming the kingdoms of the world that are going to disappear with the coming of the kingdom of Christ. Where are these people that brought us into World War I? Where are the Habsburgs? Where are this, that, they're gone. They've been swept off of history. Where are the great empires? They're gone, etc. When the kingdom of Christ comes, all earthly kingdoms disappear. We're coming down, and then, here we are, 50th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb. And he concludes his sermon. He said, so here we sit, the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. He said, but friends, from our text, we know that the cloud that will determine our destiny is not the mushroom cloud that rose up over Hiroshima 50 years ago, but the cloud that descended on the Mount of Transfiguration, saying, this is my son. Listen to him. Was dead on the floor. I'd been run over by, it was the greatest sermon I'd ever heard. And a text chosen in view of the liturgical calendar of the church happened to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima. But a guy who had dug deep in the text found exactly what was needed for that particular day. Now, Israel lived with that hope that God's chosen Davidic seed was going to bring in that kingdom. And it was going to sweep away all earthly kingdoms. It was going to sweep away all opposition to the kingdom of God in the world. It was going to put an end to all the evil that is in the world. And it is going to bring in everlasting righteousness. There will be a new heavens and there will be a new earth in which righteousness dwells forever and forever. That was the hope of Israel that had been nurtured with the Davidic covenant. The son of David would be the son of Abraham, in whom all the nations of the earth would be blessed. The nations will come to that son. They will worship at his holy mountain. They will come and lay down their swords. God will establish his kingdom. That was the hope of Israel. But they lived with that hope in the midst of much deprivation. As I mentioned, Psalm 89 also speaks of this kingdom. But as we saw last week, the last third of that psalm speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the house of God, the carrying away of the king into exile. It looked like everything that God had promised had now been squashed. There was no basis for hope whatsoever. Now here's Psalm 132. All right, we're a little down the road. Now, unless you study this carefully, your first impression, second, third, and fourth impression of reading through the book of Psalms is that this is nothing but a random collection of various poems written at different times in different places. All right, somehow or other they've been brought together here. And frankly, your fourth, fifth, sixth impression has been the impression not just of people reading in the church, but of scholars in the church. Until 1971. There were a few inklings of this along the way, and there were a few holdouts along the way, and so on, but it never reached a consensus. But in 1971, a guy by the name of Gerald Wilson was writing a doctoral dissertation at Yale. And he is the author of the first volume of commentary on the Psalms and what's called the NIV application commentary series. Gerald Wilson. Maybe his middle initials F. Gerald Wilson. Wilson wrote a doctoral dissertation on the editing of the Hebrew Psalter. The editing of the Hebrew Psalter. If you look at the Psalms that have names on them as to who wrote them, they go all the way back to the time of Moses. And they come into the period of the exile or after. So these poems have been collected across a vast period of time, going back to Moses, all right, and coming to long after David in the period of the exile and afterwards. Is there any order to their arrangement? As you get in, you will find Psalms of David in Book 5. Not a lot, but you still hear David's voice in Book 5. He dominates Books 1 and 2. In fact, the second book ends by telling us these are the ends of the prayers of David, which must have indicated that that book used to be smaller, and that was its ending back then. But it has since been added to along the way. But when they added to it, they had some other Psalms of David to put into it. All right, now why do I bring this all up to you? Well, for this reason. Gerald Wilson showed that the final editing actually did have a plan. In other words, it's not just randomly thrown together. You know, when I first started to pursue after the ministry, I thought I was going into the ministry, I began a library. You know, I start to buy Christian books, okay, and I arrange books on the shelf, okay. For years and years and years, I had a very, very small library, all right. What plan did I follow for the organization of my books, all 20 or 30 of them, that I had collected and written, all right? It was a very profound system of organization, all right? I had the tallest one on the left, and it went down to the shortest one on the right. I had church history books alongside philosophy books, alongside devotional books, and so on. They were arranged from big to little. I don't know whether you knew this, but Paul's letters in the New Testament are arranged in just that way, from the big to the little. They're not in historical order that Paul wrote them. They were put there from big to little. So there was biblical precedent for that. You go into a more substantial library, then you begin to find things in categories. So you got church history in one place, you got theology in another place, you got biblical texts in one place. Okay, so you got all these psalms. Some of them are happy psalms, psalms of praise and thanksgiving. Some of them are very, very sad songs. In fact, most of them are very, very sad songs. The Lamentations and so on. But they're not categorized according to their mood. We don't have all the sad songs over here and all the happy songs over here, although there is a certain pattern that you got a lot of sad songs up front, and then gradually as you move through over time, you get more and more happy songs along the way, or psalms of praise and thanksgiving. Each of the 5 books, and it is divided into 5 books, I don't know whether you pay attention to that as you're reading through it, but as you read through Psalms 1 to 41, Psalm 42, before it begins, it'll have a little break at the top that says Book 2. Ordinarily, a preacher wouldn't read that when you come to Psalm 42 for your sermon, but it's there if you're reading through it. And so you'll go 42 to 72, all right, before you get 73, Book 3, way up there. And then from 73 to 89 comes the next book. All right, Book 3. And Psalm 89 is the, I would call it the lowest point in the book of Psalms. It's the very lowest point. Why is that? Well, first of all, there's Psalm 88. Psalm 88 is a solitary lament. It is the lament of an individual person going through a very rough time. All right? The only ray of hope that you find in Psalm 88 is that this guy is still breathing and he's still praying. Apart from that, there's no hope. This psalm ends with this dear man saying, "Darkness is my only friend." That's how bad it is. And then you get Psalm 89. Well, Psalm 89, you think you finally came out of the pit of despair there, because for 2/3 of the psalm, it's going on about the glories of God's faithfulness to his covenant promises to David, and how he has promised gracious things to David, how he's been faithful to the gracious things that he promised to David, and so on. But as we saw last week, you get through 2/3 of it, all of a sudden, boom, you drop out the bottom. But now it's all gone. Now you have broken your covenant. Now our king is gone. The city is gone. The temple is gone. Everything has been lost. And you're back down in the pit of despair. And this one on a national scale. Psalm 88, it's one poor guy kicked along the side of the road. Psalm 89, the whole nation has been kicked along the side of the road. And there they are. And then Book 4 begins. And Book 4 begins to put you back together, one might say. Psalm 90, it's the Psalm of Moses. See, we're not in chronological order. Psalm 89, you are in the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem. How soon after that? Hard to say. It comes across as if you can still smell the smoke, I can tell you that. So it doesn't seem to have been that very long after it. But Psalm 90, it's Moses. Now, what's God doing with you here? Well, everything seemed to have been going toward a happy conclusion with a Davidic king who would reign forever. It really looked like things were going to one day just work out perfectly. And then it didn't. And the whole bottom fell out. And when it fell out, I mean, it really fell out. And Psalm 90 is Moses. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were born, or ever you had given birth to the earth and to the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And then Moses takes you into the wilderness. And not to the happy days of the wilderness, but to the days of death, when he starts talking about all the people that died. It was a lot of people that died. There were 600,000 men who could bear arms. That's a round figure. There was 603,000, something or other. 600,000 men who could bear arms that came out of Egypt. When they go into the promised land, 2 remain, Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses himself is not going to be allowed to go into the promised land. That's a lot of funerals. 599,998. And more than that, that's an awful lot of funerals. And when you live in a world where so many people are dying, the way some of our nurses and doctors are living, dealing with COVID in places that are overrun with it, when you live in a place where there's an awful lot of death, it begins to eat away at your soul. You begin to wonder whether it makes any sense to go up and get up and go to work the next morning. People are just dying, and there's nothing you can do about it. But there's Moses saying in the midst of it, even from everlasting to everlasting you are God. And his crying prayer at the end of the thing, Lord, establish the work of our hands. Establish thou the work of our hands. In other words, make it worthwhile for us to go on. Help us to see that it really matters to be faithful today and to press on. And in Psalm 91, you get the great comfort, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, say to the Lord, my rock and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. You see, the author is putting you back together after you fell apart at Psalm 89. And interestingly, he's putting them back together by reminding them, ever before there was a Davidic king, when you were way back in the wilderness, where all you were 12 wandering tribes under a sentence of death, God was your dwelling place. So he's calling them to trust in God, to take refuge in him, because he is still faithful, regardless of just how bad life can get when everyone has fled. I'm teaching a class in New Testament right now, and we recently passed through the pastoral epistles, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. All right, so we've come to the end of Paul. And the last letter we have from Paul is 2 Timothy. All right, Paul's getting ready to die. He's in prison once again. The sentence of death seems to have been passed. They're just waiting for it to be carried out. He says he's already being poured out as a drink offering. How does Paul die? How would you expect him to die? Preaching the gospel. I was doing a retreat ages ago when my son was in college up at Penn State. They had invited me up to do a retreat for them. And on that weekend, my chief mentor in the faith, Dr. John Gerstner, died. And his death came as a shock. First of all, I didn't know he's sick. Would he die? Well, he had cancer. Why didn't I know he had cancer? Well, he had put his wife under a vow. She was not allowed to tell anybody that he had cancer. Nobody was to know that he was in stage 4 and was about to keel over, because he intended to preach until his dying breath had been expended, and he didn't want people sitting out there in his classes or in his churches and so on worrying about whether he was going to take his last breath at that very moment. He didn't want them thinking about his death. He wanted them thinking about his message. All right, so his wife wasn't allowed to tell anybody just how sick he was. So when he died, we were shocked. And there were a group of us that just loved this man. I mean, this guy had been our stay in the midst of a very liberal generation at the seminary where we went. He had been our rock. So I was at Penn State. I got back. No sooner I get back, Connie and I jump in the car. We drive back to Pennsylvania. We came from all over. Had I known he was sick, we would have been there beforehand. just to say thank you one last time. That's not how Paul died. 2 Timothy. Only Luke is with me. You know that all Asia has turned against me. How about that one? Asia? That's the church at Ephesus, Laodicea, Colossae, Hierapolis, the 7 churches of Asia in the book. All of Asia has turned against me. It's not bad enough he's had the Jews after him all his life. It's not bad enough the Romans have gotten in on it from time to time. Even the church has turned against him when he dies. When he dies alone. And you think, that is just overwhelmingly sad. But you'd have thought that every person in the Eastern Mediterranean world was indebted to this man who had carried the gospel to their cities. But when he dies alone. But it was so very much the way Jesus died, isn't it? It was so very much like that. And in fact, that's how he prayed. Because in Philippians chapter 3, when he said, whatever is gained to me, I've counted as loss, all his Hebrew credentials and so on. Why did he count it all as loss? That I might know him. And he goes down, one might say, the layers of his prayer, and he ends by saying, that I might know the power of his resurrection, being conformed to him in his death. He wasn't just praying to be conformed to Christ in his image. He wasn't just praying to be sanctified like him. He was praying to be conformed to Jesus in his death. And that prayer was answered. Jesus died with just John standing there taking care of his mother. Paul will die when only Luke is with him. And yet the amazing thing is about that letter, there's no sense of bitterness. There's no depression. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. He's looking forward. The race isn't over in Rome. He's not home yet. You know, you've heard the story of the missionary returning from a lifetime of foreign service. And he happened to be on a ship with, I've forgotten the president now, but one of the presidents of the United States was on the ship that day. And so on. The president had been on the European tours coming back, and there's the band, and everybody's out there to cheer and welcome the president and so on. And there's the missionary on the ship, and he's been gone his whole life preaching the gospel. And who's waiting there for him? Nobody. There's no band or anything like that, and so on. And he suddenly got just overwhelmed with just a depression that settled in upon his soul and whatnot. And somebody happened to talk to him later, and he said, "Well, what's it like to be back home?" And then he talked about that experience. It just how depressing it was to arrive. He said, "The president was gone a few weeks. He comes back home, and everybody's celebrating." He said, "Brother, you're not home yet. You're not home yet. There is a band waiting for you, but you're not home yet." Well, what we read in Psalm 132 today, the confidence of the Davidic kingdom, David wasn't going to rest until he had found a resting place for God, and then we find out that God's not going to rest until he has fulfilled his word unto David and so on. Psalm 132 is coming in the latter part of the book of Psalms. Whenever Psalm 132 might have been originally written, its final placement is in the aftermath of the exile, when there is no Davidic king, when the country has been lost, the nation is a subject state. But hope doesn't die because they're not home yet. Lou.
Lord, just this past week, I woke up in the night and I couldn't sleep, and so I thought, I don't know how I got to thinking about, I hadn't thought about this man for a long, long time, but Glenn Connect was very instrumental in our early years of marriage, of pointing us to excitement of knowing and learning more about Jesus and a relationship with him in a deeper walk. And so I decided in the middle of the night to Google him. And I thought, wonder how he's doing. And I found a sermon. And he's 91 years old. And it was either March or May that he preached this sermon that I listened to at like 3:30 in the morning. And the humility and the love for Jesus and his amazing love for at 91, as he preached, and thanking God that still 5 Sundays a month, every 5th Sunday, they have allowed him to have the pulpit. And listening to Paul, and then the sermon of in your old age, persevering to the end, it's just amazing. Just wanted to share that about.
Well, I spoke with Glenn a while back. Time before last, they had just moved at 90. They just moved. And Glenn was 90, Betty Jane was 92. I said, Glenn, how did the move go? Oh, it's been wonderful. I said, really? Yes, he said, we have so much more room for hospitality. The last time I talked to him, he was down a little bit. Why was he down a little bit? Well, he had gone up and down the neighborhood. He had made invitations to invite everybody on the street to come to a Bible study, but only one couple had come. I said, Glenn, don't despise the day of small things. Oh, that's right, brother. Thank you. Don't despise the day of small things. Cliff Bedell told me, I'll tell you this one story, and then you got it. Cliff Bedell spent about 20 years in the Philippines. I've forgotten the exact time he was there. And I came into church one Sunday evening, and Cliff and I generally sit in about the same spot. And he was there early. I was there early. There's nobody else around, and we got chatting as we normally did and so on. And that particular night, he was very emotional. Why was he emotional? Well, he was emotional because he realized that back in the Philippines, he had nearly missed the most productive day of his life. The reason he had nearly missed it was that he had been laboring long and hard to try to make contact with a distant tribe of people that had been very hard to get in contact with, very hard to get them to agree to a meeting and so on. But after many, many, many months of labor on this, he had finally gotten them to agree to come to a particular place on a particular, and he would have the whole day to lay out the whole gospel with them. All right, this had been the culmination of a project. And he got there that day, and nobody showed up but one little kid. None of the leaders of the tribe that had agreed to come. Nobody came. And he was just spitting mad with God. He was having it out with God on this. He had put in all this work and all this stuff. And what was it for? It was absolutely for nothing. All this travel, all this effort had been wasted and so on. And then he said, there wasn't a voice that boomed from the sky. There wasn't a bright light and so on. He said, I just felt suddenly this voice spoke to my heart and said, Cliff, you came here to preach the gospel. There's a little boy here that needs to hear the gospel. Do what you came to do. He said, so I finally got myself back together again. And I worked with that little boy. He said he came to Christ. The little boy became a pastor. The little boy became an evangelist. He reached many tribes of people that nobody else had ever reached before. He led far more people to Christ than I could have ever hoped for in a lifetime. It all came down to one day. And I was telling that story to Cliff's daughter and son-in-law at a time of just remembering the specialness of that night. And the daughter said, yes, and there's more, she said, because that man's grandson is now the pastor of a megachurch in the Philippines. Thousands of people attend that church. All goes back to one day, which in Cliff's mourning he almost missed. He almost missed, despising the day of small things. He said the whole time it was far and away the most productive thing he'd ever done in the Philippines. If all his lifetime had been nothing but to sit at his desk in the Philippines and do that one day, it would have been enormously productive. But he couldn't see that at the time. And Glenn is like that. But the book of Psalms, back to Psalm 132, there they are in the midst of the exile. By this time, as Book 5 comes together, they've returned from the exile. But what do they return to? This land is not their land. They have no king upon the throne. But the hope still burns. Do not reject, for the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed. It's all come down to Christ. It's all come down to him. And when you appreciate the weight of that hope, one might say, burning across the years and the generations, you read Simeon a whole lot different when we get to Christmas season. That he would not die till he had seen the Lord's Christ. Now, let your servant depart in peace. Now, Simeon lets you know it's okay to die at Christmas. It's okay to die at Christmas. Because once you've seen Christ, everything will work out. Well, let's pray together. Oh, Lord, how we pray that you will give us that faith and hope, that though we too live in a world much in turmoil, with increasing rejections of biblical teaching, of the gospel itself, as we find things going from bad to worse round about us, Lord, sustain us with hope that we are safe because you are faithful. And that whatever this world may bring our way in terms of suffering or deprivation, we need not be without hope. We need not be without joy. We need not be without faith, because your word is true and steadfast, and you will bring to pass all that you have promised, till at last every tear is wiped away from our eyes, and there's no longer any death, neither mourning nor crying nor pain anymore, when all these former things will pass away. We ask it through Christ our Savior. Amen.